Evolution put God out of a job. The idea of evolution that we just sort of arose from a common ancestor, and all the species in the world arose from a common ancestor through processes that didn't have us in mind, that there was no plan in mind. It was just natural selection acting on random mutations to create all the different species in the world is obviously very, very popular and is sort of standard fare in scientific circles. And the question is, if this explains how we got here, then doesn't that either contradict what the Bible has to say about how we got here or obviate the need for a creator in the first place? If natural processes explain everything, then maybe we don't need a supernatural explanation like God. But we can pause and say, hey, not so fast. Is it really that clear of a picture? Now, the first thing we need to do is make sure we understand what we're talking about when we use the word evolution, because there are two kinds, or there's multiple different kinds, but there is two broad categories of what we come to think of as evolution. There's macroevolution and there's microevolution. No one really doubts microevolution. Microevolution is the idea that species tend to vary within themselves, even as they stay the same species. Different breeds of dogs, different shapes and sizes of humans based on the locations they happen to live in. If they live in cold places, they tend to be shorter and squatter to keep heat. If they live in very, very hot places, they tend to be taller and more slender in order to adapt to their environments. But they're still humans, and there's nothing about them that suggests that they're anything different. Or this happens in other animal species as well. And that's microevolution, and that's not controversial. Macroevolution is a different story. Macroevolution is the idea that things evolve from one species to a completely different species, and that species can't mate backwards with the previous species. That's speciation or macroevolution. And so the question is, does macroevolution, one, does it occur? And if it does occur, does it put God out of a job? Now, the first thing you have to recognize is this, is that even if evolution of the macro variety were really a thing, if it really happened, there'd still be a problem. And that problem is getting the material to allow evolution to occur in the first place. Evolution just doesn't happen from nothing. You have to have some kind of a creation event to get the stuff, as it were, of evolution, for evolution to work with. How do we get organic matter from inorganic matter, for example? How does DNA form from the base pairs and the nucleotides and all these kind of things? We have to get the matter first. All the atoms and the material have to be created by something. And the best explanation, I think, is that God created those things, because those are contingent things and the necessary being has to create them. So even if evolution were true, it doesn't put God out of a job, because God is still in the business of creating something from nothing. But is evolution in the macro variety actually true? We also have a chicken and the egg problem in order to get evolution going on a naturalistic framework. For example, in order to get proteins and amino acids, you have to have DNA. You have to have DNA that's able to recombine or duplicate itself. It has to be able to be unzipped, duplicated on one side, and then rezipped back into itself so that you create more and more DNA. And you need RNA in order to help you do that. There's a million things that need to happen in order for DNA to be able to recombine and duplicate itself in these kind of things to create amino acids and proteins. The problem is, in order for you to unzip and rezip DNA together and copy it, you need amino acids and proteins to do it. So there's the chicken and the egg problem. If we don't have the amino acids and proteins necessary to duplicate DNA, we can't have evolution. But we need DNA to exist in order to create the very amino acids and proteins that will get us to be able to have DNA duplicate itself. So you have a chicken and the egg problem. And I think the best explanation for this isn't that there's some kind of like mystery behind it all, other than maybe a creator, a divine designer, made it so that both of these two things exist together simultaneously without needing each other for their very existence. But there's more to this whole thing too, is that if evolution were true on a macro level, as Darwin predicted, we would expect to see a ton of minor variations across various species that lead up to our species. So we see a common ancestor, and it would branch off into a bunch of different species after lots and lots of transitional forms. But we don't really see that. There's a lot of reason to be skeptical of what some call the abundant fossil record, because that record isn't all that abundant with transitional forms. A transitional form is a form that it has some feature that's the physical nature of which is slightly different than its predecessor and slightly similar to its successor, so it's the form in the middle. And we should see a lot of those, and the problem is we don't see a lot of those. So for example, we have what's called the Cambrian explosion, and that's a period, depending on your view of things, but the standard view of the development of life on Earth is that the Cambrian explosion is about a 5 to 8 million year period in which you see a ton of fossils in various places. One is in Canada called the Burgess Shale, found by Charles Walcott in Canada, showing numerous animal forms in the Cambrian explosion without any transitional forms whatsoever. In other words, the Burgess Shale in Canada showed that there were a ton of fossils that all existed fully formed with no predecessor and no successor in the record whatsoever. They were all fully formed immediately in a very short period of time. We found something similar in what's called the Chengjiang fauna in China as well. And that was found in the 1980s with excellently preserved fossils showing the sudden appearance of animals in full formation, and in plants as well. Now, Dr. Stephen Meyer, in his book Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt, points out that the Cambrian explosion is such a narrow time frame that you can't have enough information infused into the system through mutations and natural selection to create that kind of a thing. In fact, he pointed out that a Chinese scholar, a Chinese evolutionary biologist, said that the Cambrian explosion and the fact that all the animals appeared immediately turns Darwin's tree upside down. Darwin's tree is the idea that we have a common ancestor that branches out into multiple species. But the Cambrian explosion shows the opposite. It shows that all these species suddenly existed, and as they go extinct, you get fewer and fewer species. And so this Chinese scholar said that the Cambrian explosion turns Darwin's tree upside down. Dr. Junyuan Chen, a Chinese scientist, was questioned and said, "Aren't you uncomfortable questioning Darwin?" And his response was this: "In China, we can criticize Darwin, but not the government. In America, you can criticize your government, but not Darwin." The fossil record simply does not show what we need to have confidence that macroevolution actually existed. But the Bible actually predicts that we would see life existing suddenly, as we find in the Cambrian explosion, and it would be incredibly complex. In fact, my friend Dr. Fazal Rana points out that there's a field of study called biomimetics, where we solve modern engineering problems by mimicking the way in which nature solves those engineering problems, whether it's the way birds' wings work, or bees fly, or even the propulsion systems of single-cell animals. We draw engineering inspiration from the way in which nature solves these problems. In other words, how is it possible for our finest engineering minds to be stymied by problems that mindless nature has figured out, unless that mindless nature is actually the result of a divine mind? And the Bible predicts this in Job chapter 12, verses 7 to 9. "But ask the beasts, and they will teach you, the birds of the heavens, and they will tell you, or the bushes of the earth, and they will teach you, and the fish of the sea will declare to you, who among all these does not know that the hands of the Lord has done this?"